Have you ever seen someone smile so brightly, but in their eyes, exhaustion still leaks out like droplets of water that haven't yet dried on their hands? It was a Saturday morning, and the California sun spread gold across the sidewalks. A breeze carried the scent of waffles and roasted coffee from Maple Leaf Diner, a small old cafe with tall windows and ivory-striped curtains. The kind of place that makes anyone stepping in feel like they've just returned to a warm piece of memory. Natalie Green, 58 years old, tied her salt and pepper hair back with an old elastic band as she stood by the counter, gently stirring a spoon in a latte. Every movement slow and deliberate, as if going too fast would cause her exhaustion to spill over into the cup. She smiled as she placed the cup in front of a regular customer. The elderly man nodded, leaving a $5 bill on the table, his thin, trembling hands barely steady. "You're doing a great job." Natalie gave a small smile, her eyes briefly shimmering before she quickly looked down, folding the receipt and the $5 bill carefully and placing them neatly on her tray. But she didn't head straight to the POS system. Instead, she walked past the counter and laid the receipt beside a tablet where Ryan Park, a young man with slicked back hair and a crisp white shirt, stood with his arms crossed. Ryan glanced at the receipt, smirked faintly, then tapped rapidly on the screen. The $5 bill disappeared, leaving behind a single line: "Tip processed." Natalie didn't ask. She didn't even look at Ryan. She quietly pulled a small, worn leather notebook from her apron pocket, flipped to a yellowed page, and slowly wrote, "Table 3, $5, not showing." Then she closed the notebook, tucked it back into her pocket, and took a deep breath before heading off to serve the next table. In a shadowed corner near the window, a middle-aged man sat quietly, sipping on a black coffee that had already gone cold. Grey t-shirt, worn jeans, old canvas shoes. He watched Natalie with a calm gaze, following each of her steps, each gentle smile, each nod of gratitude to the customers. His name was Thomas Miller, 46 years old, and no one knew he was the founder of Maple Leaf Diner. He had walked away from his luxurious office, from strategy meetings and numbers, to return to the place he built himself, where every tip, every drop of coffee, every broken piece of a waffle had once been something he treasured. But now, as he watched Ryan lift the receipt, tap a few buttons, and slide it into a drawer without a glance back, Thomas knew. The cafe had lost a piece of its soul. He watched as Natalie ran her hand lightly over a freshly cleaned table, adjusting a napkin that was slightly out of place, gently touching the teacup of an elderly woman sitting alone. Natalie smiled. "Would you like some extra lemon, like always?" The elderly woman looked up, her cloudy eyes suddenly bright. "Oh, Natalie, you still remember?" Natalie simply nodded and walked away, still smiling, but as she turned her back, her shoulders trembled slightly. Thomas closed his eyes for a moment, breathing in the scent of baked goods and coffee, holding on to the image of Natalie and that elderly woman, two people the world seemed to have forgotten, except for the quiet promise of kindness they continued to keep for each other. He opened his notebook and wrote a single line: "It's not about money, It's about recognition. And in that moment, he knew he was no longer the founder. He was a man trying to find the soul of his creation once more. That day, sunlight streamed through the windows, brushing over the grey strands in Natalie's hair, over the calloused hands holding the tray, over the faintly sad smile of Linda, Natalie's older co-worker, wiping down tables in the corner. Thomas sat in silence, watching it all unfold, hearing Ryan's faint scoff as he tapped the POS screen, hearing Natalie softly thank customers, hearing the ticking of the clock, and even the quiet sigh when Natalie stepped into the break room to check a message about her husband's hospital bill. He knew it was time to do something. Not for money, not for power, not for reputation, but for justice. For people like Natalie and Linda, people quietly standing in this world, hoping to see their names appear fairly clearly on the work they gave their lives to. The next day, early sunlight still clung to the glass panes as Thomas stepped into Maple Leaf Diner, dressed in the same old grey work clothes, a faded baseball cap on his head, a small fabric backpack over his shoulder, and a cleaning rag in hand. No one recognized him. They only saw a slightly stooped, tired-looking man quietly walking toward the cleaning supply cabinet. Ryan stood next to the POS system, barely glancing up. Old man, mop the floor before the rush starts. Thomas just nodded, his eyes flicking briefly toward the POS screen, where the line read, "Tip $0. Processed." He bent down, wringing out the rag, the mop water reflecting a warped version of his face on the grey tiles. But in those eyes, a small flame began to burn. Behind the counter, Natalie continued carefully pouring coffee, her left hand adjusting the faded apron, her right hand holding the hot coffee cup steady to keep it from trembling. She gave a gentle smile to a customer. "Have a warm morning." A thank you followed, along with a crisp $2 tip placed neatly on the tray. Natalie dipped her head slightly, a spark of joy in her eyes, then turned toward the cash register. But, as always, she placed the tip and the receipt next to the POS system, stepping back. Ryan glanced at her, smirked. "I got it." His fingers swept across the screen, a few beep sounds, and the tip disappeared into some unknown category Natalie would never see. Thomas stood a few steps away, gripping the rag tightly, his eyes darkening as he saw Natalie's shoulders tremble before she took a breath, adjusted her apron, and moved on. That afternoon, the cafe grew busy. Laughter and conversation filled the air. Spoons clinked against cups, and the scent of fresh waffles drifted through the room. Natalie moved from table to table, refilling coffee, checking on regulars. "Mr. Johnson, how's your leg feeling today, Mrs. Smith? Is your granddaughter over her cold yet?" She remembered every name, every story, every small preference of her customers, and they smiled warmly, leaving small, neat tips on the tables, $1, $2, sometimes even $5. But when Natalie turned her back, those tips never appeared under her name in the system. Thomas quietly mopped the floor near the register, eyes observing Ryan standing stiffly at the POS, arms folded when there were no customers, his gaze sweeping over everyone with a sneer. Each time a tip appeared, Ryan swooped in like a fox, picking up the receipt, letting out a dry chuckle. "I'll handle it. Keeps the books clean." Natalie only nodded softly. Linda behind the counter lowered her gaze, and no one said a word. Thomas knew they weren't afraid of losing money. They were afraid of losing their jobs. And silence was the price they paid every day just to survive. Later that afternoon, Thomas stepped into the small break room in the back, where Natalie was having a simple lunch, a cold sandwich and a glass of water. She took a small bite, eyes glancing at her phone, her face shadowed with sadness as she read a reminder about her husband's hospital debt for his heart condition. She gently swiped the screen, put the phone away, let out a long sigh, and continued eating in silence. Thomas sat down across from her, quietly observing her thin, calloused hands, the small scars left by decades of carrying coffee trays and wiping down tables. "Tough day?" Thomas asked softly, his voice low. Natalie startled, then forced a smile. "I'm okay. Just need to keep going a little longer, and everything will be all right." She had no idea who was sitting across from her. She just thought he was a kind old cleaner, caring in the middle of all the busyness. Thomas stayed silent, locking eyes with Natalie, and in his gaze was a quiet promise, "You don't deserve to be forgotten." When Natalie left the break room, Thomas pulled out his phone, opened his notes app, and typed, "It's not about tips. It's about dignity. It's not a system error. It's the person who set it up." And he knew. A seed of doubt had been planted. It was time for Maple Leaf Diner to have justice restored. That evening, as the last rays of sunlight streamed through the dusty glass panes, they cast uneven patches of light on the dark wooden tables. Natalie was wiping down table 6, her hands trembling slightly, but still carefully precise in every movement. Thomas stood at a distance, mop in hand, eyes fixed on Natalie. He realized something no matter how tired she was. Natalie never missed a spot on a table, a drop of water on a glass, or a napkin out of place on the floor. Every detail she tended to was a silent reminder, "I still exist." At the register, Ryan stood tall, his white shirt crisp, fingers running through his hair as he prepared to process another tip. When a regular customer left, they placed a receipt with a handwritten note, "Tip $10, thank you. Natalie." Natalie picked up the receipt, smiling softly as if embracing the gratitude within it, and, as always, stepped forward to place it beside the POS. Ryan appeared, quick as a shadow, fingers flying across the screen, a single beep, his eyes flicking toward Natalie, lips curling faintly. "All done." Natalie nodded, asked nothing, and walked away. Thomas narrowed his eyes, gripping the mop handle tightly, his chest tightening as he watched Ryan turn away with that half-smile, his finger tapping on the POS screen as if he was tapping on the dignity of people working tirelessly, unaware they were being robbed of their effort. Late that night, with the cafe nearly empty, Thomas quietly stepped up to the POS while Ryan stepped out back to take a call. Pretending to wipe the counter, Thomas studied each line on the screen. "Tip processed. Destination Operations Fund." He frowned. Operations Fund didn't exist in any policy he had set for Maple Leaf Diner. Customer tips weren't supposed to disappear into a vague fund, and they certainly weren't supposed to lose the name of the person who earned them. Thomas pulled out his phone, typing into his notes, "Phantom Fund. Who's benefiting?" The next day, the cafe was packed, with Natalie and Linda, her 65-year-old co-worker, working quietly side by side. Linda stood behind the counter pouring tea for customers, looking at Natalie with eyes filled with sympathy and shared exhaustion. Linda used to be someone who laughed often, who cracked jokes when taking orders, but now her smiles were rare, sometimes only a tired nod as customers left. Thomas noticed that every time Linda walked away from the POS, she would slip a small scrap of paper into her apron pocket, little torn notes with table numbers, tip amounts, the cash customers had left behind. He understood then that Linda was also recording the truth, just like Natalie, but she didn't have the courage to speak it aloud. At noon, in the small break room behind the diner, Linda opened her small lunchbox, containing only a few slices of apple and some dry bread. Natalie sat beside her in silence, splitting her own apple in half and gently placing it into Linda's lunchbox. "Eat some more. You need to keep up your strength." Linda smiled, her eyes glistening with tears. "I don't need much. Natalie, just enough to buy asthma medicine for my granddaughter." Natalie held her hand. "It'll be okay." Thomas stood outside, hearing their conversation through the slightly ajar door. He closed his eyes, his chest heavy. He once dreamed of a cafe where everyone was respected, where every tip was more than just money. It was a form of recognition, a way for customers to say, "Thank you for serving me with your whole heart." But now, those tips were being stolen, disappearing into cold numbers. That evening, as the last customers were leaving, Thomas stepped out to the counter, pretending to arrange cups, leaning toward Natalie. "Are you okay?" Natalie flinched slightly, then gave a tired smile. "I'm fine, thank you." But in that moment, in her eyes, was a wave of emotions she had buried deep for years. "I just want to see my name acknowledged, not for the money, but because I'm still a part of this place." Thomas nodded, placing his hand on Natalie's shoulder, his gaze steady. "You deserve to be seen." That night, Thomas left the diner late, stepping out into the breezy street, the yellow lights stretching along the sidewalk. He paused, turning to look at the Maple Leaf Diner sign swaying gently in the wind, making himself a promise: tomorrow, I'll start. The next morning, as sunlight streamed through the slats of the blinds, casting pale streaks across the diner's floor, Thomas was there early. He walked around the diner with a rag in his hand, but his eyes followed Ryan as he walked in, holding a cup of coffee, whistling a carefree tune. Ryan looked at him with a sneer. "Make sure you clean it well, old man. I don't want customers complaining." Thomas gave a small nod, saying nothing, his hand tightening around the rag, feeling the coarse fabric pressing into his skin, reminding him why he was there. In the corner of the diner, Natalie was arranging sets of silverware, wiping each lingering drop of water from the spoons, her eyes focused, patient, as if every utensil deserved respect. Customers began to enter the diner, the bell jingling softly each time the door opened. Natalie greeted them with a gentle smile, wishing you both a pleasant morning. An elderly couple sat at table 4, and the husband discreetly placed a $10 bill under his coffee cup, looking at Natalie and nodding. "Treat yourself to something, Natalie." She paused, touched, and nodded softly. But as she turned away, Thomas saw the fear in her eyes. She gripped the $10 bill tightly, walking toward the counter, looking at the POS where Ryan was already waiting. Natalie placed the $10 bill and the receipt on the counter, her voice soft. The customer left a tip. Ryan raised an eyebrow, smirking. "I'll take care of it." He grabbed the bill, tapped a few buttons on the screen. A beep echoed, and he slipped the $10 bill into the drawer, glancing at Natalie. All done. Natalie stood silently for a few seconds, her hand gripping the edge of her apron until her knuckles turned white. Then she nodded softly and walked away. Thomas stood behind the counter, staring at Ryan, fury boiling inside him. "That's not yours, Ryan." But he stayed silent, swallowing his anger, knowing the time hadn't come yet. Midday. Linda suddenly began coughing, having to sit down with her hand clutching her chest. Natalie rushed over, holding her gently. "Are you okay, Linda?" Linda nodded, her hands trembling. "I'm fine. Just need a moment." Natalie handed her a glass of water, gently rubbing her back. "Don't push yourself too hard." Linda looked up, tears clouding her eyes. "Natalie, do you ever think, all these years, we've been robbed?" Natalie held her hand tightly. "I know, Linda, but if we speak up, we'll lose our jobs." Linda lowered her head, sobbing, while Thomas stood in the corner of the kitchen, gripping the broom handle, his chest tightening. He once believed that building a warm cafe would make people happy, but he had forgotten that in any place where power exists without oversight, injustice would creep in like weeds. That afternoon, Natalie returned to serving customers with a forced smile, carrying a tray of tea to table 7, her hands shaking slightly, causing the water in the glass to ripple, spilling over the edge and wetting the corner of the tablecloth. The customer simply smiled. "It's all right, Natalie. Don't worry." She nodded, quickly pulling out a napkin to wipe it, forcing a smile that Thomas could see was hiding deep exhaustion. Thomas quietly stepped closer, softly saying, "You're doing well." Natalie flinched, then looked at him, tears brimming in her eyes. "I just don't want to be invisible." Late that night, with the diner nearly empty, Natalie sat at a corner table, opening her old leather notebook, pen in hand, writing down each line. Table 4, $10 tip, disappeared. Table 7, $5 tip, not recorded. Third consecutive day. She sighed, closing the notebook, pressing her hand on its worn cover, as if it were a habit to calm herself. Thomas walked over, sitting across from her, his voice low. "May I see your notebook?" Natalie looked at him, hesitated, then nodded, handing him the notebook with a look of quiet trust. Thomas flipped through each page, seeing the numbers, the shaky but clear notes, the red dots she circled to remember. He looked up at her. "You've done the right thing." Natalie bit her lip, whispering softly, "I'm so scared. You know I'm scared of losing my job, of not being able to pay for my husband's hospital bills, but I'm even more afraid of staying silent." Thomas placed the notebook down, looking her straight in the eyes. "I promise, you won't have to be afraid anymore." That night, as Thomas walked out of Maple Leaf Diner, he looked up at the old wooden sign swaying in the breeze, the warm light from the diner blending into the darkness of the street. He gripped Natalie's notebook tightly in his hand, his eyes burning with resolve. Tomorrow, we start to bring justice back. The next morning, Thomas arrived earlier than usual, carrying a small bag with a few items. He walked into Maple Leaf Diner while the sunlight had yet to cut through the thin morning mist on the street. Inside his bag was a small POS data capture device, no bigger than his thumb, a tool Thomas once used to protect his first stores when he was younger. He walked past the counter, bending down to pretend to mop near the POS while Ryan was in the back on a phone call, laughing smugly. "Yeah, just funnel it all into the operations fund. Nobody checks anyway." Thomas took a deep breath, slipping the device under the POS counter where the power cable ran, pressing it lightly until a faint click sounded, blending into the hum of the coffee machine. He stood up, looking around. No one noticed. The morning shift began. Customers entered the diner, and Natalie greeted each one with a gentle smile, her hands still trembling slightly as she carried hot coffee cups, but her voice remained soft. "Wishing you a lovely morning." At the register, Ryan stood like a statue, and every time a customer went up to pay, he was the last to touch the tip receipt. Thomas stood in the corner, watching each time Ryan processed a receipt with a $7 tip turned into $0. A receipt with a $5 tip disappeared into the operations fund. Natalie rested her hand on the edge of the counter as Ryan picked up the receipt, her eyes dimming for a moment, her hands tightening and releasing, as if she was used to it. Linda, wiping tables in the corner, suddenly bent over, coughing harshly. Natalie rushed over to support her. "Are you okay?" Linda grabbed Natalie's hand, her eyes red. "I'm fine. Just a bit tired." Thomas stepped forward, placing a hand on Linda's shoulder. "You need to take a break." Linda looked at Thomas, tears in her eyes, her voice shaking. "I don't want to leave. I need the money for medicine." Thomas gripped her shoulder firmly. "No one is going to make you leave, Linda." At noon, Natalie received a receipt with a handwritten note. "Tip $20, thank you." "Natalie." She smiled softly, her eyes lighting up. But the moment she placed the receipt on the counter, Ryan was there, snatching it up, tapping a few buttons, and slipping the $20 bill into the drawer without a word. Natalie whispered softly, "That tip was for me." Ryan looked up, smirking. "A tip isn't a right, Natalie. It's just a bonus." Natalie froze, her eyes welling up, but she didn't say another word, quietly turning away. Thomas clenched his fist, feeling a surge of anger down his spine. He told himself, not today, but very soon, at the end of the day. Thomas connected his phone to the device under the POS, downloading the data it had captured. Hundreds of transactions appeared. Tip $10. Destination Operations Fund. Tip $5. Destination Operations Fund. Tip £15. Destination Operations Fund. Not a single tip transaction had Natalie or Linda's name on it. Only Ryan's name appeared. Thomas took a deep breath, staring at the numbers on the screen, his eyes turning cold. It's time. That evening, Thomas arranged to meet Natalie and Linda in the small break room in the back, where old coats hung and the scent of coffee mixed with the smell of disinfectant. Natalie held her old leather notebook, placing it gently on the table, her eyes timid. "You said you would help, but they're powerful." Linda held Natalie's hand, her voice shaking. "I'm scared." Thomas sat down, his gaze unwavering. "I've collected enough evidence. I promise you both, tomorrow everything will change." Natalie looked up, her eyes glinting with a spark of hope. "Really?" Thomas nodded, his hand resting on Natalie's notebook. "You've been holding on to the truth all these years. Now it's my turn." Before leaving the diner, Thomas paused, watching Natalie as she cleaned the last cups of the day. The warm yellow light fell on her salt and pepper hair, reflecting in the rinsing water, shimmering like fragments of memory. Natalie turned around, softly saying, "Thank you." Thomas simply nodded. "Tomorrow, you'll see your name where it belongs." He stepped out of the diner, the streetlights casting reflections on the dew-damp pavement, a cold breeze drifting by, carrying the scent of leftover coffee and pastries. He knew that tomorrow's dawn would not just be a new day, but the beginning of justice at Maple Leaf Diner. The next morning, Maple Leaf Diner opened in calm, soft golden sunlight streaming through the windows, reflecting on the grey tiles still damp after Natalie mopped the floor. Natalie walked in, wearing the same old faded apron, adjusting her tied hair, her eyes still holding the patience of someone who spent a lifetime serving others, even when she herself had never been served justice in return. Linda had arrived as well, carrying a paper bag with dry bread, her eyes tired but brightening when she saw Natalie. "It's such a beautiful day today." Natalie smiled, nodding, but her hand tightened around her bag strap, her heart trembling as she thought about the tips that kept disappearing every day. Ryan appeared, holding an expensive cup of coffee, his voice ringing out. "Let's move it. Everyone, we're going to have a busy day." He stood beside the POS system, his hand resting on the screen like he was the real owner, his eyes sweeping over Natalie and Linda with a half smirk. Thomas walked into the diner, no longer dressed as the janitor in grey work clothes, but as a man in a sleek grey suit, a dark blue tie, polished black shoes. His eyes were calm, his face composed, but determination shone in his gaze. Ryan noticed Thomas, hesitated for a moment, then smirked. "Oh, here for coffee today." Old man Thomas didn't respond. He walked straight to the counter, his eyes scanning the POS screen, then looking Ryan in the eyes, his voice deep and clear. "Let's begin." Customers started entering the diner, laughter and conversation filling the air. Natalie and Linda served them with their usual dedication. A regular customer stood up, leaving a $20 bill on the table, nodding at Natalie. "Get yourself some flowers." Natalie picked up the $20 bill, walking toward the counter, looking at Ryan, then at Thomas, as if waiting for something. Ryan held out his hand. "I'll take care of it." But this time, Thomas placed his hand on Ryan's, stopping him. The diner fell silent. Natalie froze. Linda stopped wiping tables. Customers turned to look. Thomas looked at Ryan, his voice still calm. "From today on, the person who receives the tip will be the one who served the table." Ryan's eyes widened. "And who do you think you are to give orders here?" Thomas smiled softly, pulling out a card from his suit pocket, holding it up for everyone to see. "I'm Thomas Miller, the founder of Maple Leaf Diner." Whispers spread throughout the diner, customers turning to each other. "Is it really him? I've heard his name before." Natalie put her hand over her mouth, tears welling in her eyes. Linda's trembling hand reached out, gripping Natalie's hand, tears streaming down her cheeks. Ryan stepped back, his face pale, his eyes darting around as if looking for an escape. Thomas pulled out his phone, connecting it to the POS, and a large screen displayed a report. Over 90% of tip transactions were transferred to the operations fund. The only recipient name listed, Ryan Park. The actual servers, Natalie Green, Linda Moore. Thomas looked at everyone, his voice ringing out clearly. "This isn't a mistake. This is a system built to steal, to rob the hard work of the people standing here." Customers throughout the diner turned to Ryan, their eyes filled with anger. Ryan stammered, I was just following procedure." Thomas stared directly at him. Who created that procedure? Ryan couldn't answer, lowering his head. Thomas stepped closer to Natalie, gently taking her hand. "I'm sorry you've had to endure this for so long." Natalie began to cry, her hand shaking as she held onto Thomas's hand. "I just wanted to see my name. I just wanted to know that I wasn't invisible." Thomas nodded. "From today, no one will have the right to take your name away." He turned to Ryan, his voice cold. "You're suspended immediately. I will forward all this data to the legal and accounting departments for a full investigation." Ryan panicked. "You can't do this." Thomas's voice was firm. "I can, and I will." In that moment, Linda began to cry, tears of relief after years of fear, clutching Natalie's hand, whispering, "We're not invisible anymore." Customers in the diner erupted in applause, a wave of clapping filling the small cafe, sunlight streaming through the windows, illuminating the gentle smiles of relief on Natalie and Linda's faces. Thomas turned to Natalie, holding her hand tightly. "You stood strong. You were patient. Now, let me give you back your justice." Natalie couldn't speak. She simply nodded, tears of happiness streaming down her cheeks, blending with a light, relieved smile after so many years. After that tense morning, Maple Leaf Diner returned to its usual rhythm, but the atmosphere in the cafe was different. Customers still came, ordering coffee, the scent of waffles still warm in the air, but the eyes looking at Natalie and Linda were now filled with respect. Natalie walked between tables, serving coffee as she always did, but today her steps felt lighter. Each time a customer tipped, she no longer had to hand the receipt to Ryan. Each time a card was swiped, The name of the tip recipient appeared clearly on the POS screen: Natalie Green. Linda, after the lunch break, stood by the counter, carefully wiping away any coffee drips, her eyes catching the numbers on the screen. Tip $5. Recipient Linda Moore. Her hands trembled slightly. Her mouth curved into a smile, the wrinkles around her eyes blooming like flowers. For the first time in many years, she saw her name displayed publicly like this: an elderly customer with silver hair walked out of the diner, placing a hand on Linda's shoulder. "Thank you for always taking care of us." Linda lowered her head, tears streaming down her cheeks. "No, thank you for seeing us." In the corner of the diner, Thomas sat quietly with a black coffee, his eyes following each smile, each step Natalie took, each tear that rolled down Linda's cheeks. And he knew that these people had finally been seen. He opened his notebook, writing a single line: "Justice doesn't need to be grand promises. Sometimes justice is simply being seen." Ryan was no longer standing at the POS. He was suspended, sitting outside the diner, his face tense, his eyes empty. Through the glass, he saw Linda smiling, saw Natalie's happy tears as she received tips directly, saw customers smiling at them, and in that moment, he realized what he had stolen was not just money, but the dignity of those who had poured their youth and strength into serving this place. Around midday, a special moment happened. A young customer walked up to the counter, placing a receipt with handwritten words: "Tip $50. Thank you. Natalie." Natalie held the receipt, her hands trembling, looking up at Thomas sitting in the corner. He gave a small nod. She stepped to the POS, scanned it, and the words appeared: "Recipient Natalie Green." Her eyes filled with tears, streaming down her cheeks, but her mouth formed a smile. "Thank you. Thank you for letting me see my name." Customers in the diner clapped, the applause not loud, but enough to fill the cafe with warmth. Linda stood beside Natalie, gripping her hand tightly. "We're not invisible anymore." Natalie nodded, smiling through her tears. "Yes, we're not invisible anymore." That afternoon, Thomas left the diner, stepping onto the street under the gentle golden sunlight, the breeze rustling the leaves on the trees. He turned to look at the Maple Leaf Diner sign, the place that had just witnessed a quiet yet powerful transformation. In his heart, Natalie's words echoed: "I just wanted to see my name." And now she had. That evening, Natalie sat in the break room, opening her old leather notebook, flipping to the last page, writing the final lines: date, month, year, first time, $50 tip, name displayed, Natalie Green. She closed the notebook, pressing it lightly against her chest, closing her eyes, letting a tear fall onto the worn cover. But it was no longer a tear of sorrow. It was a tear of freedom. At home, Linda called her granddaughter, her voice trembling. "Grandma got a tip today, enough to buy your medicine for this month." On the other end, the little girl squealed, "Grandma, I love you. Linda smiled, tears falling, whispering softly, I love you too, and today I was seen, my dear. Thomas sat in his small apartment, a cup of cold coffee beside him. He opened his laptop, typing an email. Subject: POS system. Update: company-wide implementation. Content: from today, all tips will display the name of the actual server, without exception. We will begin with fairness. He clicked send, then leaned back in his chair, closing his eyes, taking a deep breath. In his heart, a part of his mission had been fulfilled, and the most precious thing of all, trust, had returned to where it had once been stolen. That day, Maple Leaf Diner still closed at 8 p.m. as usual, but for Natalie, Linda, and those quiet servers, it was the day they returned from invisibility. And for Thomas, it was the day he remembered why he had opened the diner in the first place, not just to sell coffee, but to ensure that everyone was seen and respected. In the days that followed, Maple Leaf Diner gradually became a different space. The old wooden tables, the scent of waffles and coffee still lingering, but the eyes of those serving had changed. Natalie walked between tables, her smile no longer weary, the wrinkles around her eyes brighter each time a customer tipped. As she herself swiped the card and saw her name appear on the screen, recipient Natalie Green. One day, a young customer placed a $10 bill into her hand, squeezing it gently. Thank you for always remembering I like an extra slice of lemon in my tea. Natalie smiled, her eyes sparkling. It's my pleasure. Linda stood behind the counter, drying cups with focused but lighter eyes. Each time her name appeared on the POS, she nodded softly to herself. You still exist, Linda. One afternoon, as the cafe quieted down, Linda sat in a chair near the window, sunlight falling on her thin hands holding her small notebook. In it, she had crossed out the lines that once read "Tip" disappeared and replaced them with new lines. Tip $5. Recorded. Tip $2. Recorded. Tears fell onto the ink on her notebook, but she didn't wipe them away, letting them soak into the page as a mark of the freedom she had just reclaimed. Thomas often came to the diner in the mornings, sitting by the window with a cup of hot black coffee. He observed everything with a calm gaze, watching how Natalie and Linda smiled when customers complimented the pastries, how they chatted comfortably with customers without having to sneak glances at the POS every time a tip came in. One day, Natalie brought him his coffee, offering a gentle smile. Hot coffee, no sugar. Right, Mr. Thomas. Thomas looked up, meeting her eyes, and nodded. That's right. And you, Natalie, are you okay? Natalie paused, the hand holding the tray trembling slightly before she smiled. For the first time in many years, I feel okay. Thomas gently pressed his hand on the table, relief in his eyes. Thank you for not giving up. On the third day after changing the system, the diner grew busier. Regulars whispered to each other, "Go to Maple Leaf Diner. You're not just getting good food, you're supporting good people. One customer left Linda a $50 tip. She froze, tears welling up. "Oh, sir, I don't know what to say." The customer smiled. "You just keep smiling. That's enough." Linda turned, looking at Thomas sitting in his usual spot, nodding, tears streaming down her smiling face. Outside, Ryan, who once manipulated the system, sat on a bench, looking in through the window. He saw Natalie and Linda being thanked, being able to smile, being able to handle their tips themselves. Ryan lowered his head, his frail shoulders shaking as he felt the stares of customers passing by, stares of disappointment, of quiet contempt. Thomas stepped outside, standing in front of Ryan, his eyes steady. "You didn't just take money, you took their trust." Ryan looked up, eyes red. I was wrong." Thomas sighed. Sometimes mistakes can be fixed, but trust must be rebuilt from the ground up. Ryan lowered his head, tears falling onto his clenched hands. That night, as the diner closed, Natalie and Linda stayed to clean up one last time. While Linda wiped down a table, Natalie placed her hand on hers. "Do you see now? We're not invisible anymore." Linda laughed through her tears. "Yes, we're not invisible anymore." Natalie smiled softly. "And I want to stay here, with everyone, for as long as I can stand." Linda nodded. "So do I." The next morning, sunlight streamed through the windows, shining on the polished dark wooden tables. The coffee grinder hummed softly. The scent of freshly baked waffles filled Maple Leaf Diner, and in that air, Natalie walked in with a gentle smile. For the first time in years, her steps didn't feel heavy in the morning. Linda was already seated near the window, holding a cup of hot tea, taking a deep breath, smiling. "I'm not short of breath today." Natalie looked at her, eyes glistening. "You know, I feel alive again." Linda chuckled, warmth in her eyes. "For the first time in so many years, we see our own names." Thomas walked in, still in his grey suit, his eyes calm but deep. He walked past each table, nodding to the customers, before sitting at his usual spot by the window, where he watched every small gesture, every smile, every glance from people who were once forgotten. Natalie brought out his hot black coffee, placing it in front of him. "Here you go." Thomas looked at her, smiling. "Thank you, Natalie." She paused for a moment, then softly said, "Thank you for giving me back my name." Mid-morning. A young customer walked up to the counter, paying the bill and tipping Natalie $20, saying, "Thank you for always remembering I don't take sugar." Natalie smiled, walking to the POS, scanning the tip, the screen displaying clearly recipient Natalie Green. She nodded softly, a tear falling onto her hand, but she didn't wipe it away, letting it soak in as a reminder I still exist. That afternoon, Thomas stood up, stepping into the middle of the diner, his eyes sweeping over the customers and the staff. He spoke in a deep, clear voice. "Have you ever wondered why we walk into a cafe, pay for our food, and then leave a tip? The diner fell silent, listening. We do it not just for good food or warm coffee, but because we know, behind every cup of coffee, behind every pastry, there is a person standing there, serving us with kindness. Thomas looked at Natalie, then at Linda. A tip isn't just money. It's our way of saying, "I see you." Applause filled the diner, not loud, but warm. Natalie and Linda stood side by side, smiling through their tears. That evening, Natalie sat in the break room, opening her old leather notebook, flipping through the pages that once held the painful lines. Tip disappeared. She took her pen, crossing out those lines, writing a new one. Today, $20 tip. Recorded. I have been seen. She closed the notebook, pressing it to her chest, closing her eyes, taking a deep breath, her heart light. Linda sat beside her, phone in hand, texting her granddaughter. "Grandma has enough for your medicine this month." A reply popped up. "Grandma, I love you." Linda smiled, tears sliding down her cheeks, replying softly, "I love you too." Ryan, who once manipulated the system, quietly returned to the diner, standing outside looking through the glass. He saw Natalie smiling, Linda smiling, customers smiling. He lowered his head, his hands clenched, tears falling. For the first time, he realized what he had lost was not just money, but the trust and respect of those who once believed in him. Before leaving the diner, Thomas stepped over to Ryan. Ryan looked up, eyes red. "I'm sorry." Thomas looked at him, stern but no longer angry. Apologizing is necessary, but making amends is what matters. Ryan nodded, tears streaming. "I want to start over." Thomas placed a hand on his shoulder. "If you're sincere, I will give you that chance." That night, Maple Leaf Diner closed later than usual, but no one complained. Natalie and Linda stayed to clean, standing in the middle of the diner, looking at the neatly arranged tables, the warm yellow lights creating a comforting glow. Natalie turned to Linda, smiling. "Today was a good day," Linda nodded, "and tomorrow will be even better. Everything is finally back where it belongs." Ryan, the man who once manipulated the system, had returned to work not standing at the POS anymore, but wiping tables, cleaning, learning how to bow his head to thank customers, learning how to smile when customers tipped Natalie or Linda. He quietly watched as customers offered compliments, as words of gratitude were shared, and in his eyes, a glimmer of remorse and a determination to make things right began to shine. When the last warm yellow lights were turned off, and the glass doors of Maple Leaf Diner closed with a soft chime, Natalie stood inside, looking out at the night street, where the streetlights reflected warm streaks onto the dew-kissed pavement. She placed her hand on her chest, where her old leather notebook still rested inside her apron pocket. Today, she had written the final line in that notebook. Date, month, year, tip, $10, name displayed. I am no longer invisible. And then she closed the notebook, placing it in the drawer, no longer afraid that tomorrow someone might take it away, might erase the words that guarded her pride. Linda stood beside her, gently squeezing Natalie's hand. "Tomorrow, we'll meet here again, won't we?" Natalie smiled, her eyes brightening. Yes, tomorrow, and many more tomorrows. Across the street. Thomas stood looking at the Maple Leaf Diner sign, the night breeze gently stirring the fallen leaves. He understood that it was time for him to step back, to hand this place over to the people who had protected it even when they had nothing but their tired feet, worn hands, and resilient hearts. But more than anything, Thomas knew that justice had become part of the breath in this place. You know, there are battles that don't need guns, that don't need loud slogans. There are battles that begin with a missing tip, a stolen smile, a forgotten name. And then justice is reclaimed from those very small things by people who dare to stand firm in the flow of life, who dare to hold on to kindness, who dare to believe in their own worth. If today you are tired, if you feel invisible in this vast world, if today you feel like your efforts have gone unnoticed, remember this: you deserve to be seen. You deserve to hear thank you. You deserve to be respected. And above all, you deserve to be proud that you have lived a kind life.